about education for startups. And I would like to invite our moderator on stage, Veneta Andonova. Veneta is a professor. Veneta is a professor at the American University and also a big friend of the startup community in Bulgaria.
Thank you very much. It's my biggest pleasure to be part of this event and to be the host of the panel. And I'll now introduce the speakers. Bob Dorff is the author of the Startup Owner's Manual, the step-by-step guide for building a great company. He's an expert in customer development. Please help me welcome Bob Dorff. Elena Stoichkova is the CEO of Junior Achievement Bulgaria. She's an entrepreneur and an educator. Please, let's welcome Elena. And our third participant today will be Tobias Stone, a co-founder of the iFocus Accelerator, a new accelerator launched in Bulgaria in 2015, and a friend of Bulgaria who has been around since more than 12 years. So we're here to discuss a topic about which we all feel very passionate, and it's about education for startups. And I'd like to open the discussion with a provocative question. And my question is, there are a lot of very visible, successful startups whose founders are college dropouts. How this fact affects our thinking about entrepreneurial education? May I invite you to start off?
Sure. I think this sort of movement of encouraging young people to spend less time getting a basic education, basic building blocks of life skills and life learning is silly, it's foolish. We all need a solid foundation, and the odds of someone being significantly more successful because they started their first startup instead of finishing college are so small that the, so to speak, return on investment from dropping out of college is horrible compared to the value of the life skills and foundational education. And I think it is, as Peter Thiel is paying young entrepreneurs $100,000 to drop out of college. I think you shame on them, in my opinion.
I'm very glad to hear you say that. I think also, as we all know, startups are very likely to fail. And if you drop out of college to do your startup and then fail, you don't have your degree to fall back on. But just one of the things about your statistic, there's a very high correlation between entrepreneurship and dyslexia. So actually, a lot of the college dropouts who started successful companies are also dyslexic. Personally, as a dyslexic entrepreneur, I think with his third degree in 10th year of university, I think the two are compatible. I think most of the skills I gained at university, I use in entrepreneurship as well.
Thank you. Elena, would you like to well?
Well, it is actually, to me, rather nicely surprising to hear both Bob and Toby say something that I have been preaching. I think it's really, I would put it as a juxtaposition, dropping out of college versus and being entrepreneurial versus being well-educated or having the good grounds to be good in analyzing your environment. Because to me, it's not a question of dropping out of education. Maybe the education that is around is not challenging and good enough for some people, so that they really stay and continue to develop their knowledge and skills.
Thank you very much. I'd like now to encourage the audience here in the room to use the opportunity to ask questions and to vote to the questions that others have posted. What you see here on the screen is a count of the most popular questions, and those will be subject to our guest discussions in the last 10 minutes of this panel. So please be active and use the tool. Now I'd like to direct the conversation as to how do we measure the effectiveness of education for entrepreneurs? Because the previous lecture was about the importance of metrics and understanding how effective we are in what we do. How shall we approach this?
Can I bounce that question back to Bob with the first point which we were just discussing before? In an entrepreneurial degree, something like a degree in entrepreneurship, are we teaching people to take risks and have ideas, therefore be entrepreneurs? Or are we teaching entrepreneurs the skills they need to do their startups, which I think then ties into your question?
Well, I don't believe we can teach passion and drive and commitment. That's somewhat almost genetic. It can be a skill you can nurture and cultivate, but all the sort of Tony Robbins videos in the world aren't going to turn a couch potato into an ambitious, driven animal. And I believe the job of entrepreneurship education is to teach the tools, whether it's customer development or software coding or selling skills or digital marketing. Those are the tools that entrepreneurs use to build successful businesses. But if they don't have the commitment, the passion, the drive, and a little bit, right, there's an old saying that there's a very fine line between insanity and genius. And the entrepreneurs need a little bit of both to take on this crazy high risk, high reward, career path.
I would further that by just saying that I come from a culture where traditionally in the UK, you would study anything and then have a job. So you might study English and become a lawyer later. Whereas I think in most other cultures in Europe, it's more normal to study what you're going to do. But what I found is, I studied archaeology. There are transferable skills in all higher education. Learning how to manage your time, structure your ideas, learning how to write. And when I'm mentoring, which I do a lot around Europe, those are the three things I pick people up on. It's amazing how many of the startups can't do basic time management, structuring ideas and writing. So I think the education, a lot of the education is generic. It's where it's relevant.
Well, it's funny you studied archaeology. I studied Old English literature and read Beowulf in the original edition. For some strange reason, it was the 60s, whatever. But to your question about dropping out of college, I started several businesses in college, one of which was a job matching service to help students at the college get jobs at the businesses in town. It's a lovely little business. I sold it for a little money when I graduated, but the most important thing was it got me the job that launched my career back when I was an employee. Got a call one Saturday morning. Hi, I'm the news director of the radio station in town, looking for an English major, a junior or a senior with a car who I can trust to show up for work at 5 o'clock in the morning. I said, don't move, I'll be right there. Got the job and graduated from college barely because I was too busy to go to classes. Graduated with 2 years of professional news broadcasting experience that launched my career. So there sometimes can be a balance between showing up at every class, getting the diploma, learning the basics, and beginning your entrepreneurial career, while you're there. I'm sure
archaeology involves turning up somewhere, creating a team, managing the team, and executing something. And that's a completely transferable skill.
But more than Beowulf, I'm sure you did.
I'd like to call your attention to one of the questions that is getting so much attention by our audience. And it's the question about what is the number one habit that is a prerequisite for becoming a successful entrepreneur. And I wonder, as educators in that field, what your recommendation will be.
Well, I think a successful entrepreneur would be anyone, I would find anyone who's actually managed to turn one idea into reality, to make it happen. And that if this idea was something that they really have been perceiving very strongly, that really beats in their heart too. But to me, maybe I think it's really to be open-minded and disciplined about what you want to do.
Would you like to recommend something for
For an entrepreneur, they understand that every day is Wednesday. They don't have weekends.
And I think, actually, I go back to one of the students I had in the summer semester at Columbia, young woman with a mediocre idea for a sort of e-commerce fashion, direct-to-the-consumer marketplace for high-end ladies' business blouses. And I was beating on this woman saying, how are you going to test this? How are you going to prove it? How are you going to show an investor that this is a good risk? And she said, well, I am sure I can raise the money. I've already talked to people who are willing to give me the money. I said, based on what? She had the most magnificent answer I think I've ever heard, which is, those people know me, and they know that when I put my name on something, I work at it relentlessly, night and day, weekends and holidays. And when my name is on it, it will not fail. It didn't make me any more confident in the business, but it made me immensely more confident in this young woman as someone who will grow up to be an exceptional entrepreneur.
I'd like now that we talk a bit about our original state of education for startups. And I would like to ask the speakers, who do you think is the best position to provide such education in Bulgaria and the region?
I think what we're seeing already, it's other entrepreneurs. And that's what's exciting about the emergence of the ecosystem here with 11, with Launch Hub, which involves dozens of successful people already. It's really handing those skills down generation to generation.
I think we can say that somewhat we've been in this business for some time. To me, I would go back to a question of, do we teach entrepreneurship, in developing skills? And I think this is really what it is, and then finding the right tools. Entrepreneurship is not a degree you could get, but what we really need is to be something that is pervasive everywhere, in all of throughout the educational system, more as an attitude and an approach to the way we are teaching and then learn. And so to be based on the process of discovery, when and being interactive, being really involved in that process. So I think, to me, the actually one of the solutions is that it needs to be offered as a cross-disciplinary field and theme throughout all of the different majors, and also to be developed as a way of behavior and mindset from very early age on. Because it makes,
who can do that?
Who can do that? I think our organization is one of those that is doing this in one way, but I think it should be all of the universities should be striving to do that. And then the way to do it is also to invite the right role models and the right people to transfer the spirit and that different kind of approach, and also showing by example.
Now I'd like to add to this question and address about, do you think entrepreneurship education belongs to business school?
Not particularly. I think that's where it's found a home. And for example, at Columbia University, there is a huge debate now about how do we break this out of the business school and involve the medical school, the school of public affairs, the journalism school, the law school. And in some of my classes, I have social ventures coming from SIPA, the School of International Public Affairs, with ideas that are never going to make anybody a lot of money, but they're going to change hundreds or thousands of lives, often in the third world. And to me, Some of the skills are business skills, some of them are life skills, and some of them are engineering skills. And so we need to make all of those skills accessible to really successful entrepreneurs. A successful entrepreneur doesn't have to be an engineer, but they have to have had a course in how to have a conversation with an engineer. Here is what I want you to build. Here is how I think it will work in a language the engineer will understand. That's a life skill, whether your next job is a startup or a bank. And I think very few universities are really doing this successfully, because universities like to compartmentalize. Oh, we teach journalism over there, entrepreneurship over here, math and science over there. And I think you need a little bit of all of those things, right? An entrepreneur who can't read a balance sheet is going to get in trouble very quickly, probably, very rather urgently. And so there are really so many disciplines that touch on, successful entrepreneurs. And I think the other big difference between entrepreneurial education and other forms of education, right? If you are going to become a surgeon, the way they teach you to remove a piece of somebody's brain is you watch one, you assist in one, and you do one, right? Very little classroom learning. The same is true for entrepreneurship. Every young person who says to me, I want to start a company, I want to be an entrepreneur, I said, what is your hurry? 22 years old. Why don't you first spend a year making coffee and cleaning the toilets and doing crap work at the smartest startup you can find that will let you in. And in exchange for cleaning the toilets, you get to sit in the conference room when the bright leaders of that startup are having conversations about, you can understand how it works and how they think and how they make decisions and operate. And that, to me, is the closest thing to a PhD in entrepreneurship, as opposed to taking lectures from the many great scholars at universities all over the world.
I'd like now to take yet another question from the audience and ask our participants in the panel today, if they were 20 today and with no money and no idea, with all your knowledge, what business would you start and why?
Well, I was going to say, I think I would start a counterfeiting operation, because it's the fastest way to a great deal of revenue, and sooner or later you get a very long vacation with 3 meals and a car. Unfortunately, with no Wi-Fi because you're in prison. But God, that's a very difficult.
Can I defer back to Bob's last point about cleaning the toilets as a bright startup? I wouldn't suggest somebody who's 20 with no money and no idea starts a business.
So I think
you should start a business when you have a fantastic idea for a business, not when you want to start a business.
Well, and if I could just add one thing to that, you should start a business. Finding a business to start as an entrepreneur is no different than falling in love. It's not the first man or woman you meet, or the third, or the eighth, or the one in the fancy suit, or the hot dress. It's the one that makes your heart go thump, thump, thump. That's the business I want to devote my life to, the way you say about your future spouse. That's the spouse I want to have as my life partner, because in any startup, there are lots of dark days. What's going to get you through those dark days is not how much money you might make someday. It's, do I love going to work every day? Does that love and excitement carry me through the difficult times? Because without that, the dreams of wealth are just not enough to get you through the many, many challenges and deep, dark days we're going to have in almost any startup.
I would like now that we go for our last question in this panel, and I'd like the participants to recommend to all of us ideas to improve the general culture about entrepreneurship in Bulgaria and the region? What can we do when we walk out of this room?
Well, I've been out here for about 12 years in Southeast Europe, and I think talking to some of the people running the accelerators here now as well, the problem is ideas. There's lots of people who want to do startups. There's lots of very skilled and brilliant people. My biggest complaint is about context. People need to have a very big context. And the problem the others were saying in their talks, you need to know every single competitor. You need to know everything happening in your space. And people have trouble doing that sitting here. So I'd say the actionable thing is really build big networks, travel whenever you can, meet anyone you can who travels here, and try to get a very big context to understand what you're doing within that.
I think the most important thing an emerging entrepreneurial economy can do is get the successful entrepreneurs out of the closet and celebrate them and make them accessible to the aspiring entrepreneurs. Have them host or host for them coffees or luncheons where they can just not lecture, but have general sort of freewheeling discussions about the issues on the entrepreneur's mind. Because that unlocks an incredibly powerful resource. The second thing, which may be Elena's next project, I hope, is to create a sort of network infrastructure. I mean, think of the immense talent sitting in this room. You may have this tiny little startup that is still a long way from success, but you are a fabulous e-marketer or database architect or front-end designer. Make yourself available to your peers. Trade a few hours of your time with another company for a few hours from a third company that helps you area your week. In other words, sort of facilitate the networking among the vast talent pool in this room so you can help one another succeed and grow in the areas where you're weaker. I think that, to me, is a great way to unlock tremendous natural resources in Bulgaria and to accelerate the pace for all of you.
Thank you.
I think really one of the best ways we could accelerate this is to support the efforts of each other to be collaborative and really to spread the word and also the behavior that being an entrepreneur could be just the future, a career opportunity for everyone. And to really promote this in the schools. And I'm really serious about that because I think in a sense, we still in Bulgaria trying to do things in the last moment and more short term rather than longer term. And the more we really look at this as being something that we can benefit, as also everyone around us can benefit in a good way, you know? Experience that it will support. So the more you give from you, also to support the development of the kids, of the younger people, this is really a great way to contribute to push this forward.
Can I turn that into an actionable point? The great thing about social networks and networking is it's reciprocal. The more you give to your network, the more you get back. Echoing what everyone has said, I would suggest that everybody in the room tries to find somebody else they can mentor. And if everyone is mentoring somebody behind them, everyone will be getting mentored by somebody ahead of them as well. And that's how you really strengthen your whole ecosystem.
That's great. The one thing I would just like to comment on is something Elena just said. Entrepreneurship is not for everyone. And the sooner you can determine whether you have the drive and the determination and the willingness to give up your friends, your soccer games, your beer parties, to put your head down and work relentlessly on your startup, it's just not for everyone. And even those who are willing to work that hard, most will not really succeed. And so the sooner you can sort of personally evaluate your own desires, you know, if you want to have puppies and play a lot of soccer and play a lot of darts with your friends in a pub, maybe you should get a regular job. And an old partner of mine used to say, some people work to live. Entrepreneurs live to work. It's a dramatic difference in the way you are setting the tone of your life. You should recognize that and confront that individually, as soon as you can.
I think these were great pieces of advice that you gave to our audience. So let's thank our panel participants for their time. Thank you very much. I think there is a break right now, and we'll be looking forward to meeting you again.
There's no break. Yes, yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Thank you. So guys, we have 2 more talks before the break, before the lunch break. And next, I would like to invite on stage one of the founders of 500 Startups, Marvin Vial. Marvin? Oh, he's not a founder, just a partner. Sure. So, short break. 1 minute break. Everybody can talk to the person on their left or right side if they don't know. You choose left or right. Get to know each other.
Yeah. We've got all the questions. I saw that there are lots of questions for this discussion with a lot of interest. And we'll send all the panelists your questions, and if they have time, they will answer. We'll publish it in the blog post on the conference blog. So thank you very much for being so active, asking questions. They're not lost.
Okay. Hope so. Let's see. Sorry about that, AV issues. This is working. All right, great, awesome. Good morning, or it's afternoon, right? Good afternoon now. My name is Marvin. So I'm actually going to talk about growth. And just to clarify, not a founder of 500 Startups. I wish I was. I'm just a partner there, right? Just a partner. So this is my established credibility slide. I'm a partner of 500 Startups. I'll talk about them a little bit more. I mentor also at about 20 different startup accelerators across the globe. I actually sit on a bunch of boards and advisory boards, mainly in the digital media and ad tech space, e-commerce. And also spent about 10.5 years at Yahoo. And before this, I actually spent 2 years, before Yahoo, I spent 2 years actually at an e-commerce company. Raised about $50 million and then proceeded to waste $50 million and learned a lot of lessons from that. And so 500 Startups, just if you guys don't know about 500 Startups, we are a global seed funded accelerator, have probably close to 8 over the last 4.5 years. We have an accelerator program in San Francisco, which I actually run, as well as in Mountain View. And I also, we are seed funds, so we make a lot of investments, usually in early stage companies, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the guy below this picture here, that's actually Dave McClurk, he's the founding partner of 500 Startups, if you have never met him before. And why have you come into sort of existence? A firm like ours would have existed even like, I would say 5-6 years ago because of big changes in the startup world. And a lot of these changes, I mentioned to you the previous startup, a company called Libris that I actually worked at, was an early employee at. Half the money that we actually raised was actually to buy servers, right? And the other half was actually go buy sort of like marketing, online and offline marketing. And these great platforms now, like Amazon Web Services, Rackspace, PayPal, you have all this infrastructure that's in place now. You can rent and help you scale. On the other side, from the marketing side, you have amazing platforms like Facebook, Google AdWords, allow you to reach billions of people very, very quickly, or even things like the App Store. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too. But yeah, despite that, you know, and if you haven't read this book, this is an awesome, awesome book by Ben Horowitz and Andreessen Horowitz. Awesome, awesome entrepreneur. The reality is startups are hell, right? This is an incredibly challenging time now. It's on one hand, it's easier to do a startup. On the other hand, it's actually really, 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 really hard to do a startup. You have tons and tons of companies in competition at early stage, and lots of intelligence out there. So it's incredibly competitive right now. And just because you actually can do a startup doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a successful startup. It's become much more challenging these days. And you know, this sort of in line with what a lot of the other speakers in the panel said before. This is from Katerina Fake, who was the founder of Flickr, founder of another company called Hunch, which was sold to eBay. Is working on the right problem is more important than working hard. And I know lots of entrepreneurs by nature work very, very hard. My question is, we see lots and lots of companies that are you working on the right problem or working on something that you actually care about? And this is actually something we look for very, very carefully in companies we bring into our program, in companies that we also invest in our VC fund. And I think one of the benefits, we talked about how it's easier and harder at the same time, there's real startup methodology now. And this has actually been a big, big change over the last sort of couple of years. Eric Ries, you know, which is actually his book, Green Startup, is based on Bob Dorff and Bob Dorff's customer development process, right? Bob Dorff as well as Steve Blank's customer development process. Things like Little Bets, this idea of bringing in scientific methodology, testing ideas before you actually build a product. These are all relatively new things, but a lot of this stuff did not exist before. So there's actually great ways of thinking about how you build startups. And this is huge, huge change. But one of the things that I think is really, really important, just because you experiment and do all these things with all these tools that are available, I think one of the big changes now, and I think one of the big differentiators as a startup founder is you really have to think about vision. And so, you know, one of the companies I invest in, a company called Shots. What really differentiates it is like it's a selfie app, right? You're like, okay, well, big deal. What's lots and lots of selfie apps? And what was actually different about these guys, besides the fact that they're just small founders, what was different about them was that they realized that your team, you know, one of the hard things now, like bullying is a problem. One of the things is just esteem is a problem, and positivity, lack of positivity is a big problem. And Shots, one of the fastest growing sort of apps around now, I think they did something like about 1 million downloads in 4.5 months. Not just because I invested, not just because of the traction, but because of the ultimate vision that they had. This is a selfie app that actually promoted like positivity. You're not allowed to comment, and there's no follower counts. And I think that was one of the reasons this app has grown so quickly, because of this vision that this founding team actually had of really helping sort of, in my opinion, fix a real problem in that demographic and generation. I think the other things you want to think about when you're looking at sort of doing a startup, or at least have a startup idea and executing it, is really this like language to market fit. And this isn't my idea. This is something I took from my friend James Currier of just, you know, how you describe your product and think about your product. So there's an example of just like one great example that was shown is like, you know, for example, finding a date or actually helping a friend find a date, right? Or sharing your photo versus sort of like hosting, you know, or sort of like storing your photo. You know, you have to describe your product in sort of the function, describe your product in the benefit that the end user actually has. And there's very, very clear distinctions in actually how you think about this. And one tip I give a lot of founding teams is that, for example, if you launch an app, the best way to figure out sort of how your products are being used is look at the reviews. For example, in the Apple App Store, look at the reviews of how customers are actually describing your product. Take that and wordsmith that to actually figure out what your language to market fit is. Because many times you can start thinking, I think users are going to do this, and this is how they're going to use my product. At the end of the day, it's just a hypothesis, right? And the way that you're going to figure this out is actually watching how they use this and how they describe it. And this is actually one area that is, I think startups actually overlook a lot. And you know, Paul Graham of Y Combinator, we mentioned, you hear a lot about probably one of the best accelerator programs on the planet. It is the best accelerator program on the planet, in my view. It's about doing things that don't scale. And where this is actually really important is understanding the stage that your startup is in. And based on that, that's actually how you get contacts, right? This term contact comes up a lot, I think in the last conversation, in the last sort of panel. When you think about context, it's about what stage is my startup in, and where do I get knowledge? Sort of where are the mentors that actually get knowledge in doing this? I think too many people go and read these blogs, and they're helpful. I think that's one of the best things that's around. There's so much great knowledge, so many awesome books out there right now. But really understanding, okay, if I'm an early stage startup and not figure out product to market fit, probably doesn't make sense for me to get sort of mentorship, and it doesn't make sense for me to get advice and expertise or read books about a startup that's been around for 4 or 5 years and growing from 40 or 50 million users a month. That is probably not relevant, especially on the growth side of marketing and figuring out these tactics. Probably doesn't make any sense versus maybe I should go and look at this company 2-3 years earlier when we're in a very similar stage, right? And so you guys should have this slide, but think about are you in the traction stage, are you in the transition stage, or in the growth stage? All the strategies that go on are very, very different. And also how you think about this, marketing versus growth. I think one of the previous speakers talked about growth, right? Of marketing versus sort of what we call growth hacking. Marketing is about buying your users, right? And that's actually the marketing side. And on the growth hacker side, it's where do you find them? And I'll talk more about this slide. Yeah, here it is. Growth hacking, right? Have you guys seen these books before? A guy named Sean Ellis. He's probably the guy who coined the phrase growth hacking. He's a friend of mine. And this is a great book if you haven't actually read this. And what's interesting about this is growth hacking actually could only come from places like Silicon Valley. And the reason for this is because a lot of startups don't have money, so you figure out ways of actually growing organically or virally, or actually building this into the product to grow organically and virally, right? And I think one of the things that if you think about this is that what has made growth hacking so different is that you're actually relying on actually building viral loops into your product. And that's actually unique, right? Think about these great companies like Dropbox, LinkedIn, Facebook, WhatsApp. These are all companies that grew with very little actual marketing spend. And not every single product can do that, right? Not every single product category can do that, but a lot of those tactics you can actually adopt for your startup yourself, right? And I think this is, have you guys heard the R metrics? This is actually created by my boss, Dave McClure, and it's a great way to look. If you have a startup right now, or you have an older company, a company that's been around, this framework is a great way to look at where you focus on finding, where you're actually going to focus on fixing your problems and where you focus on growing. So you look at acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, referral. And I think too many companies focus just on the acquisition stage when you should be thinking about stickiness, as Debbie mentioned earlier. The activation retention phase is great. You bring in these users, whether you buy them or sort of from viral loops, but how do you keep them on your product or service? And I think there's too many companies actually focus on the wrong thing. I did a project before my days at 500 Startups. There's this company that's spending close to, I think it's almost $200,000 a month in advertising, right? This is a 4.5-year-old company. And what was happening is that they were just churning out users. And I remember talking to the CEO, and I'm like, well, why are we spending money? Wouldn't it be better to take that $200,000, $300,000 and actually put it into fixing the product, or at least going and putting the right metrics in place, and understanding why these users are actually churning out, right? And that would have been a much better use of your money, right? A much better use of your resources. And so anyways, this is an awesome, awesome framework. If you aren't using this right now, you should be using this to go and figure out where you should be focusing your company and your time and energy. And in some cases, maybe acquisition is the right way to think about it. But in most cases, I actually think it's not acquisition. In most cases, it's actually the activation retention phase. That's actually way more critical in the early stage, in my opinion. And the reality is growth is a process, right? All these companies, LinkedIn, Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, they all have growth teams, right? And this is really, really, really hard. It's about making small bets, figuring out what your hypothesis is, right? So you think, I think our audience base is going to be these type of people. And I think when they come to our site, they're going to do these things. And it's about building sort of a good testing methodology in place to sort of see what is actually sticking, what isn't working, right? And the reality is that's about doing a lot of experiments. And why this is really, really hard is because 9 out of the 10 experiments that you run are going to have inconclusive results. But the whole point about this is by running a lot of these experiments and tests, you learn a lot about your user base, about your product, This actually becomes a massive competitive advantage over most of your competitors. And the reality is that this is really, really difficult. Think about, I've talked to lots of startups where it's like, yeah, I did this A/B testing thing. I spent like, a month setting up this A/B test, right? And there were no results. So like, this is a waste of my time. It's like, that's actually not the case. 9 out of 10 of your tests that you run are not going to work. And that's actually okay. The whole point is a process that you put in place that over time, these small little learnings that you have become big, massive competitive advantages, sustainable advantage over your competitors. Because this is so difficult, right? Like all these things you talk about, it sounds really simple, but they're really hard to do, and it takes time. And what a lot of people didn't realize is, Facebook, there's a period of time where, going back to my last framework, they spent a lot of time acquiring users, and they realized with so much churn, how do we build our viral loops? How do we retain our users better? They actually spent a year figuring out like the retention and acquisition piece, running lots and lots of tests before they figured out what the retention was. And went, okay, now we can acquire new users, right? It took a year to figure that out. That's how hard this is. But now that's a massive competitive advantage for them, right? Now they're close to 1.4, 1.5 billion users across the globe. Think about that, because for every single user they bring in, they know the likelihood of losing these users are very, very low, right? Okay, and I think one of the benefits as well too is platforms, right? I mentioned earlier, this has been a big change over the last like 4 or 5 years. There's tons of these platforms now that have over 1 billion users, or at least hundreds of millions of users, and you can actually access potential users and bring into your product. And that's a huge change, right? And I think I'm particularly excited on, you take a look on your sort of right side, like the messaging apps, these are going to be the next big growth channels in my opinion, particularly in e-commerce. It's very, very exciting. WhatsApp, WeChat, super, super interesting. And I think, but the one thing about this is that channels change over time. This is another slide I borrowed from my friend James. Think about like how quickly channels change, right? Everyone knows about Zynga, right? Zynga was a massive success probably about 3-4 years ago. But where most of the growth came from was from Facebook. But the problem is when Facebook changed their algorithm, all of a sudden you saw a big drop in their business, right? And so the reality is that most growth comes from 1 or 2 channels only. And it's your job through this rigorous growth testing methodology to figure out which channel works for you and your product. And so this is probably one of the most interesting slides I've seen recently, like about the growth in Facebook, and now it's a challenge because of keeping up with everything. Then I remember back like in the early 2000s, the big growth channel was actually Google AdWords. That's actually not the case anymore. Still a great tool, but that was actually where a lot of startups, particularly a lot of e-commerce startups, actually grew, which is actually on the back of actually, grew on the back of actually Google AdWords and Google SEO. And that's why there's this framework from a guy named Justin Mares. He's actually a distribution hacker at 500 Startups. He actually wrote a book called Traction. If you haven't read it, it's an awesome, awesome book. But he talks about the bullseye framework, right? Where you focus a lot of your energy, whether it's budgets or your time, on sort of 1 or 2 of the highest sort of like highest potential channels, and then you basically it's a methodology that basically Coca-Cola uses, right? They have the 70-20-10 methodology, right? You spend 70% of your time and money on the channels that you know will work very, very well for you. Then you spend 20% on sort of next emerging channels, and you spend 10% on sort of big, sort of long-term channels that may or may not work, but that's your experimentation, right? And this way, you diversify your results. You're not overly sort of focused, not overly sort of dependent just on 1 or 2 sort of channels. That's where you're going to get your initial growth. But long term, it's about scaling, right? And finding these other channels that will work for you. So this is one methodology. There's another methodology from a guy named Andrew Chang, another well-known sort of growth hacker, and he's also a mentor of 500 Startups, is what they call like the barbell framework, right? And these are 2 different frameworks. It's kind of up to you to sort of see what makes sense for you. But something to think about, the way to think about new growth channels, is that this is taken from financial sort of investing, right? So you have one side, you take half of your portfolio, whether it's money or time, and put it into very conservative investments, right? And so from finances, it'd be bonds, right? The likelihood of losing money on bonds, or at least losing all your money on bonds, is very, very low. So these are your growth channels that you know work very, very well for you. So in situations as could be Google AdWords, could be Facebook ads. And the other side, these are sort of, you put a whole bunch of your things like venture capital or things like stocks are a little bit riskier, but have higher sort of potential sort of ROI returns. And this is the way you think about this. Could be new channels like WeChat, right? Or new channels like, I'm trying to think, like Instagram. Well, let's say arguably Instagram is probably a sort of proven channel, or Pinterest. New areas that have high potential, but could actually, but are somewhat more risky, right? This is actually how one other sort of methodology to think about new growth channels for your business. And the great thing about this now too is analytical tools. There's so many awesome analytical tools in place now for you to go and measure how you're actually running these tests. When I was starting off, like way back in '99 in the startup world, a lot of these tools you actually have to build yourself, and I have to bug engineers to go and build this stuff. Now you can actually go to things between tools like Optimize or Unbalance, Kissmetrics, Follow, tons and tons of these products that you can actually use now off the shelf as a startup for cheap, and actually put this and use this to measure how well you're doing as a business and how well your product is actually doing, which is very, very powerful. And this is also very recent, in the last like 3 to 4 years, fairly new. And one, sort of my favorite law, how I live my life, how I look at business as well too, is Pareto's law. It's an 80-20 rule, right? 20% of your users are going to drive 80% of engagement. Same thing, 20% of your customers are going to drive 80% of the revenue of your business. If you can understand this, what your goal is to do is to understand when you have initial usage in your product or initial customers, is to go and figure out who's my 20-80, right? Which 20%, how do I find more of these people? What are the characteristics of these 20% that drive 80% of usage, or 20% who give you 80% of your revenue? How do I find more of them? Where do they hang out? These help drive where you're actually going to grow, right? And if you want to take this even further, how do you find the 20% of the 20% that drive probably 40, 50% of your growth, or 40 or 50% of your revenue? This analytics is really, really powerful, and you should not ignore this. And so if you take anything away from this presentation, understand the 80-20 rule. It's going to change your life and change your business and how you look at your business. And last of all, in my opinion, culture and community really matters. And so 500 startups, we have over 840 investments. We have something close to like 1,200, 1,400 founders, have almost close to 280 mentors. This community, this growth mentality is really important. Of the type, how you think about growth in your community. For example, I'm very deeply interested in online marketing and growth hacking. So I talk with a lot of other growth hackers, distribution people, online marketing, because there's a lot of knowledge. Everyone's trying out a lot of new things. There's a lot of lessons. This is incredibly powerful. This is how we learn very, very quickly in this area. And last of all, in my opinion, is balanced teams, right? To execute on this, you really need sort of what we call the hacker, the hipster, and the hustler, right? Hustler is the business person. Hipster's design. Do not underestimate the importance of design in building your product and thinking about your product. And last of all, is you need, and not an issue in this region, you have awesome tech talent, people who can build. And I think it's this combination that makes startups actually work well. I think we tend to have we do a lot of pattern recognition, right? Because we have so many companies coming through our program. I've seen 90 companies come through our program already this year. In Silicon Valley, we invest in, I see about anywhere between 15, 30 companies a week that I look at for seed investments. We have a very, very big sample size, and we always find the best teams in general, the best businesses have this very, very balanced team. And at the end of the day, according to the Immortal Paul Graham, is basically you have to make stuff people want, right? Because all these tactics and growth hacking, as wonderful as it is, online marketing is wonderful as it is, if you are not building something that people want, all you're doing is spamming them. And so the reality is that figure out what people want, and that's why things like customer development process works, right? Things like Lean Startup. These are all basic things to help you figure out whether there's a market. All this growth stuff does, it just accelerates that. And so this is the last slide of my presentation. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this is helpful.
Thank you very much. So guys, I don't know about you, but I was curious. What is this prize that the guy who has tweeted the most things gonna get? Because I've been tweeting so much, hoping to win the prize. So here it is, the next meeting. It's a really nice, compact high quality speaker you can connect to your phone or to your laptop. And it goes to the person who has printed the most today. All right, next, I want to introduce our next speaker. He comes from Founder Centric, Jordan Schlicht.
Thank you. Howdy. Good afternoon. It's time between you and lunch. So I'm going to get through this. I really agree with a lot of what Marvin was saying previously. So I'm just going to try and build on that where I can. And let's get to lunch. So I'm going to talk to you today about the traction process. And let's figure this one out. The traction process. Anytime now. It's just lunch. Keep going. Oh, yeah. Woo. Before I do that, I'm one of the partners at Founder Centric. And I know you've met Devin earlier this morning, so I won't labor it. We're a collection of 4 serial entrepreneurs who've been through accelerator programs, who've raised money, who've been investors. And really, what we're passionate about now is designing and teaching startup education, entrepreneurship education. We really want to increase your chance of success and get you to build the businesses of your dreams. So, the traction process. As Marvin referenced before, this is the awesome book by Gabriel Weinberg and James. It's the traction book. I highly recommend that you go out and buy it. And I'm just going to briefly go through some of the stuff that's in this book. Now, Gabriel Weinberg, his startup is one of the dumbest ideas possible. He is competing directly with Google on search. This startup is DuckDuckGo. Like, why would you do this? Why would you use this instead of Google? But the interesting thing around this, he is succeeding. He is succeeding to systematically gain searches and traction and volume from Google. Now, each one of these points is an interesting methodology he's applied to get that. I will come back to that later. So he's succeeding. The real question is, how is Gabe doing this? How does he go and like take traffic off Google? Well, the interesting thing is Gabe has seen sort of 5 key mistakes he's seen other founders make. And Gabe, he's built a ton of companies. He is an investor, right? He's building DuckDuckGo. He's someone we can trust. Mistake number 1. They didn't start traction until they finished the product development. So where founders go and they build the entire product, and they're like, oh, now we need to go get traction. By doing traction in parallel at the same time as doing your product, there are some awesome benefits you can get from this, right? So using that initial customer development to inform your product roadmap. Matt Clayton is the CTO of Mixcloud. He's got just over 2 million monthly active users. With his product, he started to turn off features to see if anyone would complain. And what he found is a ton of features that when he turned up, no one complained. He had built a ton of stuff, which he estimated was about 6 months of dev time, was completely unnecessary. So this concept here is using that initial customer development to reform what you're building and why and when is really, really important. It also allows you to test your messaging and your distribution channels before you've even launched the product. So that when you do launch, you have a nice base of initial users. I've seen some phenomenal startups basically fail because they run out of runway. They run out of money and have to stop and go get a real job. This is the reality of being an entrepreneur. There's this short period of time we need to go and build our business. And unfortunately, when we have investors and people looking at us and saying, have you got the company to a stage where I can invest in it? Common questions are always along the lines of, how are you going to go get users? Oh, I'm just going to blog. I'm going to go on Facebook. Well, what evidence is that you're going to work, that's going to work for your business? What evidence do you have that you can do this with your team? So it is really important to pursue, to do traction in parallel with product development. Mistake number 2, the teams didn't spend enough time on traction. Now, if we think about this in terms of distribution, distribution is equally important as product. You could have the best product in the world. Say you've got the iPod, but you cannot get it to the customer, it is useless. So the way I like to think about this is you should be spending 50% of your time on trying to figure out how to get it to the customer, how to get your product or your service to the customer, thinking about distribution. Now, the thing I like to think about here is that tech teams in particular play to their strength, which is building products. But this is everyone. This is a fundamental human nature. We are lazy creatures. We take the path of least resistance naturally. What does that mean? It means that if you're an awesome hacker and coder, what do? You build products, because that's what you're good at. And you've got something that's coming out that's tangible. You look at it, ooh, my website, my app, we are making progress, team, right? We stick to the stuff that we are good at. But unfortunately, in order to make a business success, there are other things you cannot afford to ignore. Distribution is definitely one of them. Mistake number 3, they didn't take advantage of these micro opportunities. These micro opportunities, essentially, these are unexpected and temporary things that pop up that allow you to spike your growth, that allow you to take advantage and gain traction. If we were to think about this, we look back at what Gabe is doing, every one of these little box numbers is a micro opportunity that Gabe has seen and jumped on and capitalized on to generate growth for his business. Number B, or sorry, letter B, is, I love this, this is awesome. So there's this massive Google press where Google is getting slammed in the press for stealing your privacy, right? And it was hitting the news, the main news. And so Gabe was like, they are getting slated. This is an opportunity for me. So he said, I'm going to put a billboard up. In 24 hours, he had a billboard up in San Francisco where Google is headquartered. It was like, Google tracks you, we don't. Come to DuckDuckGo, right? This is a micro opportunity. This might not be scalable to continue to do billboards like this as an engine of growth, but it's an opportunity to play with an experiment and to potentially capitalize and not leave money for users on the table, to take it off. I also like to think about this in terms of new platforms. Marvin also mentioned Instagram, Twitter, they only made advertising possible in recent years. Imagine if you were there when Instagram launched and made publicly available the advertising platform and you started advertising that. What an opportunity. It's like turning up at a massive supermarket and you're the only product on the shelf. You don't have the competition, it isn't saturated. So these might be micro opportunities that eventually, when the rest of the market floods into Instagram or into the channel, it might become too expensive for you. You might not end up working in the long run. But it's a great opportunity to jump in when it arrives. But in order to be doing that, you need to be spending time. You need to have that 50% of your time ring-fenced to be able to capitalize and to see these opportunities. You have to be watching, flexible and creative. So you need to be spending enough time on it. Who here thinks they are spending 50% of their time on pursuing traction at the same time as building their product and service? Beauty, you're awesome. So, mistake number 4, they were biased toward or away from certain traction verticals. What is a traction vertical? It is just a channel. It is an opportunity where you can go and acquire users, you gain users. So there are these things where it's traction comfort zones. Every startup relies on blogging, Twitter, and AdWords, but they can't be the solution for everyone. What about billboards? What about PR? What about publicity stunts? The reality here is I'm a sales guy. So I try to solve a lot of my traction problems by just selling. Direct sales. That is my comfort zone. And I need to have the discipline to break that natural tendency I have to play to my strengths. And to really make sure I've explored, and the team, me, have explored the big picture, all the options, so that we know that we have found the best few available to create the most value for our business. Mistake number 5. They didn't take a systematic approach to getting traction. The usual approach is to build product, then frantically try to figure out how to promote things. Then haphazardly attempt the obvious stuff. Oh, a bit of blogging. Oh, let's do some Twitter, a bit of Facebook. Google, Google AdWords, yay. It's not good enough. And if you have that clock of runway, are you going to be able to get your business to the stage where it unlocks the next investment? Be it joining an accelerator program, getting some business angel funding, seed capital. Are you going to be able to do that before you have to go get a real job? So let's quickly blitz through the traction process before we get to lunch. Now, there is no recipe for growth. If I had that, I'd be sitting in my yacht, tanning myself right now. But as in all parts of startup, there is no clear steps or best practices for figuring out marketing or growth. Instead, we have to take this iterative, experimental approach, which is what Marvin was talking about. It's what Eric's talking about in Lean Startup. It's what Steve Blank and Bob Dorff talk about in Startup Owners Manual. So let's talk about just the approach of the process. 1, have an educated guess at a few traction verticals. So the question you ask yourself is, what are some of the ideas for the most promising traction verticals for your business? So let's go through the big picture, or a snapshot of it. Traditional PR. What about newspapers? What about magazines? Television ads? What could a PR firm do for your business? Publicity stunts. Rename a Bulgarian town after your company. Balloon around the world with a goatee. How can you get their attention? What about search engine ads? Unexploited search terms, cheap keywords. How much does a click actually cost you? How much does it make you? Online display ads, Reddit ads, StumbleUpon ads, sponsor a blog, sponsor a podcast. Who else has page views and needs money? What about SEO, which is basically content marketing? Have you exposed the content you already have? Where would you expose it? Could you create content at scale? Can users create content at scale for you? What about biz dev and partnerships? Exchanging mailing lists, a widget on someone else's website, cross promotions, celebrity evangelists. What do you need? What can you offer? Blogs in a target market. Who are the top blogs in the right place? What could you offer them? Exclusive content? Maybe it's product giveaways. Give them free samples, tools, guest posts. Your blog, what if it took it seriously? Do you have access to unique data and insights? What is the main call to action of your blog? Could it be optimized? What about viral referrals? Are there any features inherently about sharing and including other people in your product or service? If not, can you add some referral mechanism? What if the whole product was about that feature? User gets user. Trade shows, rent a booth, give a talk, sponsor a trade show, show up a manual, collect sales leads and business cards, create your own trade show. Public speaking, conferences, yay! Workshops, industry meetups, speaking online by YouTube or webinars. It's really powerful stuff. Existing platforms, built on top of Facebook, Pinterest, iOS, MySpace, apps for Salesforce, Microsoft, Xbox. All of these things. Direct sales, hitting the pavement, cold calls, LinkedIn messages. Have you actually tried picking up the phone? We live in a world now where it's so inbox heavy. Have you actually tried picking up the phone? Do it. Create an event, conferences, workshops, webinars, meet your partners for your customers. I know Martin and Chris and all the organizers of Startup Next Person, they've become friends. Right? They've met Bob Dorff. Bob Dorff knows who they are. It's catapulted them to the top of the industry. And it's given them an insane network they can now leverage. What about you creating your own event, meetup? Offline ads, billboards, newspapers, events, flyers, and posters. Have you realized how effective mail campaigns still are to this day? You tried it? What about acquiring a small business with smaller sites? Some small sites can be bought for less than $10,000, which, to be honest, I can't afford them. But in theory, you could go and do this, right? Has anyone in your space gained a bit of traffic and failed to monetize it? You should buy that traffic. What is the abandoned properties in terms of domain names out there? Can you reach out to the ex-founders? Basically, there are a ton of options. Make sure you explore them, right? So, step one, have an educated guess with all these options and a few traction verticals for your business. Number two, list them all out in potential usefulness, which is your initial guess, right? Then approach the most promising verticals, say your top 5, with small but effective tests. They need to be measurable. So Pat Coffee, for example, that just sells subscription coffee. In the early days, so Stephen Rappaport, the founder of this business, his first business was a business called Crash Powder, which he sold to Airbnb, exactly the same. And now he's doing subscription coffee. In the early days, he was like, where can I test? What are my channels are going to be effective for me? So what about ads on Reddit as a community, the coffee forums and the blogs? So he started pasting bit.ly links in his coffee forum on Reddit, saying, hey, if you love amazing coffee, check it out. He was tracking it. So, oh, Reddit seems to be working. So let's try and let's spend $50 on online display ads on Reddit and measure what happens. He started experimenting by putting in leaflets in with Amazon orders in the packages to see if that channel would work better. Turns out it does. It works really well in packed coffee. So if 1 or 2, this is step 4 on the traction process. If 1 or 2 of the initial 5 seems promising, focus hard on them. Double down on those 2 things. Really optimize them. In summary, the traction process is this simple. Have an educated guess of a few traction verticals, step 1. 2, list them all out in potential usefulness and make sure you've thought about all of them. Don't be lazy. Approach the most promising verticals with small but effective tests that you can measure so you know whether it's successful or not. And 4, if 1 or 2 of the initial 5 seems promising, focus hard and double down on it. But do not forget the 5 common mistakes. You have to be spending the time. Do not fall to the traction comfort zones. That's it. Gabriel Weinberg with the book Traction Book. I highly recommend it. It's awesome. We are founder-centric. If you love cat photos, follow me on Twitter. Otherwise, let's have lunch. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot. So guys, as you know, next step on the agenda is lunch break. Remember, what's your goal? Meet at least 1 person you have never met before. All right, let's go have lunch.
Wchodziło? Super. Ne avrei posto io, questo non sto. Andiamo, quello. Così.
Adesso vedi il passaggio.